12 million people held their breath. Jasmine Crockett confronted Tucker Carlson with leaked emails, secret tapes, and one devastating line that silenced the chamber. Carlson left without a word. What was the sentence that crushed him and shocked the nation? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The doors to room 2141 burst open, cutting off even the sound of camera clicks. Jasmine Crockett walked in, not as a guest, but as a warning. In dark blue, her outline was sharp, her presence sharper. In her hands, she held a heavy file marked 300 in red. She didn't look around the crowded chamber. Her eyes locked straight on Tucker Carlson, leaning back at the far end, legs crossed, smirk fixed, as if it were just another primetime show. The air grew tight like a rope pulling shut. No whispers, no movement, only tense silence broadcast live to a divided country. Jasmine sat down slowly, setting the file on the table with quiet weight. This was no simple paperwork, it was a weapon. Around her, lawmakers shifted in their seats, but she stayed still. The committee chair leaned into the mic, voice steady and low. We are here to decide if the media knowingly spread lies and who must answer for it. Camera lights blinked. Jasmine didn't flinch. Tucker tugged at his tie. This was not the start of a debate. It was the start of a showdown years in the making. As the tension settled into a heavy stillness, Jasmine opened the file not with showmanship, but with the steady hand of someone who has carried truth long enough to feel its weight. The pages made no sound as she turned them. Only her voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. Exhibit A, she said, holding up a printed email with blacked-out headers that revealed just enough to draw everyone closer. An internal note from Mr. Tucker Carlson, dated November 9th, 2020. 2 days after the vote stopped, but long before the lies did. Her eyes stayed locked on him. Quote, "Of course it's not real, but people want to hear it. We can't start calling them idiots." The words rippled through the chamber. The weight of it pressed down heavy like guilt once hidden. Reporters glanced at each other, some frozen, others already typing. Jasmine didn't move, though her fingers gripped the edge of the next page, not from fear, but from control. "Let me repeat that," she said slowly. "It's not real, but people want to hear it." She looked first at the panel, then at the cameras. That's not just careless. That's deliberate deception pushed to millions night after night, because fear paid better than truth. For the first time, Carlson shifted, uncrossing his legs, his jaw tightening. Jasmine pressed forward, flipping to another message. "Here's another," she said without raising the paper. "He calls Sidney Powell, the woman who spun some of the most reckless lies of 2020, crazy. Then he writes, but if we don't air, her Newsmax will." The sentence landed like a trap, not because he believed her, not because the public needed it, but because a rival network might win more viewers. She let silence stretch, not for drama, but because truth, when it cuts, needs room to sink in. Then she spoke again, softer but sharper. "Do you understand what that means? Millions of Americans went to bed each night believing they were being robbed. Not because of foreign propaganda, but because you, Mr. Carlson, chose to sell fear as fact." She laid the papers down, neatly folded her hands, her voice steady but unyielding. "That isn't journalism. That's betrayal dressed as news." Her eyes turned back to him, her tone almost mournful now. "You had the platform, the trust, the voice. But you used it not to inform, but to control. Not to tell truth, but to hold power. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. And millions paid the price." Carlson said nothing. He didn't blink. But the room itself felt altered. The mask had slipped, and with it, the silence. Still, truth rarely goes unchallenged, especially when it threatens power. Carlson didn't flinch at first. He laced his fingers, leaned in with the ease of a man who had spun scandal into success. "We didn't deceive anyone," he said smoothly, voice steady, almost dismissive. "We gave voice to millions. That isn't misinformation. That's representation. There's a difference." His eyes flicked to the cameras, fully aware his words would be clipped and spread within minutes. "And unlike some here," he added, letting the pause hang like bait, "we don't claim to know better than the people. We don't judge their anger. We air it." The suggestion hung in the room like smoke, poisonous but familiar. Jasmine stayed quiet for a beat. She breathed the kind of breath that comes after hearing confidence mistaken for truth too many times. Then she answered, careful but exact, like walking a path she knew well. "Let me be clear," she said. "What you call airing grievances, I call manufacturing outrage. What you put on air wasn't a mirror, it was a spark. You didn't reflect anger, you fueled it. And you did it for one reason: fear sells faster than facts." Her eyes never left his, and the balance of the room seemed to tip her way. "You gave people what they wanted to hear, even when you knew it was false. You convinced them they were victims of a stolen country, and you watched them act on it. While they burned, you cashed in." Carlson forced a tight smile, more performance than feeling. "So you're the self-appointed guardian of truth?" he asked, voice edged with sarcasm. "A politician deciding which outrage counts. That's convenient for you, not for the people." Jasmine leaned forward, not to escalate but to cut through the mask. "No," she said, her tone lower but firm. "I'm not a referee, I'm a witness. I've seen what your words did, not from a studio but from the streets. I've spoken to mothers whose children stormed the Capitol because they believed you. I've seen voters stay home not because of law, but because of fear you spread. This isn't about opinion, it's about consequence. And here, Mr. Carlson, consequences matter." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. It was the silence that falls when performance meets responsibility and learns it no longer controls the story. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just building a legal argument, she was forcing the room, the cameras, and the nation to confront the human wreckage left behind by manufactured outrage. This wasn't about fact checks anymore. It was about grief. And when she stood, her voice was softer than before, but carried the gravity of a funeral bell. "Madam Chair," she said, "I'd like to introduce a citizen witness whose life was irreversibly changed by the broadcast we've discussed today." She turned slightly toward the rear of the chamber. "Mr. Alan Myers, please come forward." The sound of his footsteps, slow, uneven, heavy, cut through the air sharper than any gavel. Alan Myers looked like any ordinary man, gray slacks, a worn blazer, eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. But the way he held the small photograph in his hand made it instantly clear this was not just another opinion in the room. This was a father, a man carrying the full weight of a story no one should have to tell. He approached the witness table, adjusted the mic awkwardly, and cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, eyes down. "I am not someone who usually talks like this, but I have to today." He held up the photo for the panel to see. "This is Jacob, my son, 27 years old, former National Guard. He believed in this country more than anything. He believed in people like you." He said, his eyes locking on to Tucker Carlson. "He didn't miss your show, not once. He trusted you more than he trusted me. You told him night after night that his country had been stolen, that his voice didn't matter unless he fought back. And so he did." His voice cracked. "I begged him not to go to D.C. on January 6th. I told him it was dangerous. But he said, 'Tucker says we have to stand up, Dad. If we don't, we lose everything.' That was the last thing he said to me before he packed his bag." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled metro ticket. They found this in his pocket, along with a note to his little sister. "He died near the west entrance, crushed, alone." And for what Alan's voice lowered almost a whisper now, for a lie, not a mistake, a lie he believed because you made it sound like patriotism. He looked directly at Carlson. "You never said his name. You probably never knew he existed. But he knew you. He trusted you. And if he hadn't listened to every word you said, I'd still have my son." The room didn't just fall silent, it seemed to stop breathing. The photograph in his hand trembled again before he gently laid it on the witness table, like lowering it into the ground. "You didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Carlson, but you loaded the gun." No one moved. No one interrupted. "Because how do you argue with a father's loss?" Jasmine stayed on her feet, letting the silence linger. Not to dramatize, but to respect the truth just spoken. Her eyes welled, but she didn't blink. This was not her pain, but she carried it now. Because someone had to. And the man sitting across from her, with all his power and platform, never had. The room was still thick with grief, a silence carved not by fear, but reverence for the photo still resting on the witness table, for the father who could barely breathe through his own truth. But grief, no matter how raw, rarely stops those skilled in deflection. Power doesn't apologize. It recalibrates. And Tucker Carlson, veteran of 1,000 controversies, knew exactly when to shift from silence to strategy. He hesitated just long enough to appear human. His mouth tightened, his eyes briefly fell to the photo of Jacob, then returned to the room with something colder behind them. What happened to that young man? He began, his voice lower, slower, almost mournful, his heart breaking. No one, least of all me, wants that. But then came the pivot. Clean. Practiced. Still, I can't be held responsible for how people choose to act on information. Millions of Americans heard the same broadcasts and didn't do what he did. They didn't storm buildings or clash with police. They asked questions. They sought truth where institutions had failed them. His tone shifted with each sentence, slowly returning to form. If a handful took things too far, twisted the message into something violent, that's not journalism's failure. That's a failure of individual judgment. A tragic one, yes, but not mine. He glanced toward the committee as if inviting them to agree. Extremists exist in every movement. We don't shut down speech because someone misinterprets passion for permission. Then he turned to Jasmine, carefully knowing the cameras would catch the stare down. You've stood on stages and demanded change. You've challenged systems. You've spoken truths people didn't want to hear. Surely you understand the danger of being blamed for how someone else reacts to your words. The room didn't gasp. It chilled. Because what Tucker had done was familiar. He stepped out of the blast radius without ever admitting the explosion. He wasn't taking responsibility. He was managing optics, painting himself not as the match, but as the misunderstood messenger. But everyone in that chamber, especially Jasmine, knew exactly what he was doing. And this time the truth was watching. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, not with rhetoric, not with redirection, and certainly not with the myth of lone guilt. What Tucker Carlson tried to frame as an isolated misinterpretation, she was about to expose as a deliberate culture, one that didn't just tolerate hate, but monetized it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence around her did more than enough. Slowly, with both hands, she lifted a heavy-bound transcript from the binder before her. It bore the seal of federal authentication and the initials AG printed in firm black ink on the corner, Abby Grossberg. Jasmine looked around the room before she spoke. We've heard what Mr. Carlson said in public, she began. Now it's time we hear what was happening when the cameras were off. Her voice was even, but behind each word was a simmering current of fury. Abby Grossberg, senior producer, Fox News. She worked on Mr. Carlson's show for over 2 years, and in her sworn testimony given under penalty of perjury, she described what she called, quote, a newsroom ruled by fear, sexism, and casual bigotry. She paused for emphasis, then turned a page with surgical precision. She writes, women were routinely shut out of editorial decisions. We were interrupted, mocked, and referred to as liabilities if we pushed back. I was told to smile more in meetings and not to question the tone of certain segments, even when they bordered on white nationalist rhetoric. Murmurs rolled through the gallery, but Jasmine didn't stop. She flipped again. On the subject of anti-Semitism, producers made jokes about Jewish billionaires controlling media narratives. I raised concerns, and I was told to lighten up or get reassigned. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained anchored. And here she added, holding up the page, she describes a work culture where slurs and racial tropes were tossed around with impunity, where the boundaries between commentary and cruelty were deliberately erased for the sake of keeping ratings high and headlines edgy. She placed the transcript on the table with a dull thud, then looked directly at Carlson. This wasn't about chaos. It was about control. You didn't lose the narrative, you authored it. You built a culture where hate could hide in plain sight, cloaked as sarcasm or satire. And you protected it because it worked for you. Carlson's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Not yet. Jasmine leaned in, quieter now but sharper. You didn't just shape public opinion. You shaped a workplace where cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded. The chamber remained breathless. Crockett stood there, not grandstanding but grounding. She wasn't just reading from a file. She was holding up a mirror and daring the country to look. But when the walls of public accountability begin to close, in the instinct of the powerful is rarely humility. It's deflection. And Tucker Carlson, no stranger to pressure, didn't hesitate to reach for the oldest weapon in his arsenal, discredit the accuser. He straightened in his seat, his voice sharpening as the air in the room turned electric. "Let's not overstate this," he said, each word measured, careful dripping with controlled contempt. Abby Grossberg is a former employee. She wasn't terminated because of her values or some alleged toxicity. She was terminated because she was no longer effective in her role. That's the truth no one here wants to say out loud. He let the words linger, then leaned forward slightly, just enough to give the impression of candid honesty. What she's offering you now isn't testimony. It's a revenge narrative. And frankly, I think everyone in this room knows it. He gestured loosely toward the transcript on the table, as if it were a prop, not a sworn document. We're living in a culture where personal disappointment becomes performance, where someone loses a job, then reappears months later with a lawsuit, a book deal, and suddenly they're the voice of conscience. He looked directly at Jasmine as if daring her to object. "You know as well as I do, disgruntled people can say anything, especially when they're desperate to be relevant again." His voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Abby wasn't some moral sentinel. She was a producer. She didn't object when the ratings were strong and the paychecks cleared. But now suddenly she's the heroine in a screenplay she's writing for herself. The words were meant to be cutting, final, but they echoed in the chamber like something else, fear dressed as confidence. The kind of fear that lashes out when the illusion of control begins to crack. Carlson had reduced sworn allegations of misogyny and anti-Semitism to petty office drama. And as he leaned back with a smirk, it became clear he hadn't discredited Abby Grossberg. He'd exposed his own playbook. Tucker Carlson had tried to do what powerful men have done for generations: reduce a woman's lived experience to a grudge, her testimony to a tantrum, her pain to a performance. But Jasmine Crockett didn't meet that tactic with outrage. She didn't need to. What she wielded instead was something far more unsettling for men like him: calm, unflinching truth. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need them. She simply turned her body toward the committee, her voice clear and even like a surgeon explaining what she was about to cut away. "Mr. Carlson," she began, "women don't seek attention. They seek justice. They seek to reclaim the voice that was stripped from them by men, by institutions, by the machinery of media that valued ratings over respect." Her words didn't explode. They landed, heavy, measured, honest. "You called Abby Grossberg a disgruntled employee. You made her sound petty, small, replaceable. But let me tell you what I see when I read her testimony," she said, lifting the transcript still lying before her. "I see a woman who survived a culture that told her to laugh off humiliation, to stay quiet if she wanted to keep her job, to smile while others profited from her silence." Her voice dropped slightly, not for drama, but for control. She didn't come forward for fame. She came forward because there's a limit to how long you can hold poison inside before it begins to rot your soul. She looked directly at Carlson, and for the first time, she didn't just speak to the room, she spoke to the millions watching. "You see, when men like you are accused, your first instinct is always the same question: the credibility of the woman. Dismiss her, diminish her, dehumanize her. Because if you can make the world believe that she is the problem, then you never have to be the solution." She turned back to the committee, but her words still echoed toward him. "That's not a defense. That's a pattern. And America's starting to recognize it." There was no applause, no grand gesture, just silence. The kind that fills a space when truth has taken all the oxygen. Jasmine hadn't defended Abby Grossberg. She had reframed her as a symbol of every woman who dared to speak in rooms that weren't designed for her voice. And Tucker Carlson, with all his media power and practiced dismissals, suddenly looked very small in the seat he once owned. But Crockett hadn't come to this hearing to debate abstractions or dissect ideologies. She came with receipts. And this next piece wasn't speculation or testimony or secondhand memory. It was a window, a rare unfiltered glimpse behind the curtain of performance into the moment when the mask slipped and the truth, the real truth, revealed itself. Without a word, she lifted a small remote from her folder and turned toward the committee's audiovisual technician. A screen descended from the ceiling lights, dimmed slightly, and the room fell into the kind of hushed reserve for verdicts and final breaths. This clip, she said, her voice smooth but steady, was preserved from internal Fox News studio servers. It was recorded immediately after a live segment aired on November 10th, 2020. It has never been made public until now. A timestamp blinked onto the screen, 11/10/2020, 9:32 p.m. EST, Fox News Control Room, Studio B. The grainy footage showed Tucker Carlson pulling off his earpiece, stretching back in his chair, face flushed from a high-energy segment. He chuckled, then laughed harder, shoulders shaking. "That was gold," he said offhandedly to someone just off camera. "Dominion should send me a thank you card. We're keeping them relevant." He paused, then added with a smug grin, "What do you think, should we run a segment next week about them being operated from a cave in Venezuela? That'll give the base something to chew on." Laughter followed, not the nervous kind, but the easy, comfortable laugh of men who knew they were untouchable. The clip ended after just under 30 seconds. No music, no commentary, just raw, unedited reality. The stillness afterward was suffocating. Aides stopped typing. Reporters slowly lowered their phones. The oxygen seemed to thin as people processed what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a damning soundbite. It was confirmation. This wasn't a man caught off guard. It was a man comfortable with the lie, aware, calculating, and entertained by it. Jasmine let the silence hang, her hands folded in front of her. "You just saw a man mocking the very lie he helped sell to millions," she said, her voice low but thunderous in effect. That wasn't satire. That wasn't a joke gone wrong. That was clarity, undeniable clarity of a person who understood the falsehood and aired it anyway, because the audience demanded it and the network rewarded it. She stepped closer to the center of the hearing room. There was no hesitation in that laugh, no doubt, only certainty. The certainty that truth was irrelevant and that he could shape reality as long as the cameras kept rolling and the advertisers kept paying. She turned to face Tucker directly. "Mr. Carlson, you've sat here portraying yourself as misunderstood, misquoted, mischaracterized. But that clip, your words, was not filtered through a liberal lens or twisted by a panel. That was you, off air, unmasked, and laughing." The room had no rebuttal, not yet, not from the press, not from the committee, and not from Tucker, because no statement of denial could compete with a moment that spoke for itself. The footage had ended, but the silence it left behind did not. It hung there, dense, charged, unnerving, as if the room itself had to process what it had just witnessed. Tucker Carlson sat motionless, at first his hands resting on the polished wood of the table, fingers twitching slightly as though searching for the weight of control he no longer held. His eyes didn't meet Jasmine's or the committee's. Instead, they drifted toward the floor, then the ceiling, as if looking for a line that might rescue him, a fragment of script that could restore what had been shattered by 30 seconds of undeniable truth. And then, too late and too rehearsed, came the smirk, a cold practice thing meant to reassert dominance, but now drained of power. "If this is your witch hunt," he muttered, voice tinged with deflection, "then by all means, good luck." The words were meant to dismiss, to reframe himself as the victim of a spectacle, not the architect of one. But there was no laughter, not from the audience, not from the press, not even from his own allies on the dais, because something had shifted. The charm was gone. The sarcasm, once disarming, now read as hollow, and the room, once tolerant of his posture, had lost its patience. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The power of that moment wasn't in the counterattack, it was in the stillness. In the way the committee chair looked up without speaking, his pen paused mid-note. In the way the court stenographer slowly resumed typing, her fingers stiff, deliberate, as if aware that she was now recording history, not just testimony. In the way the Republican senator 3 seats down, who had spent the first hour checking his phone, now sat fully upright, eyes locked on Carlson, brow furrowed not with outrage but realization. And it was in that silence that the tide turned, not with a gavel, not with a ruling, but with a shift in gravity. This was no longer just a hearing. It had become a reckoning. And Tucker Carlson, for all his years of controlling the frame, now found himself trapped inside it, exposed, unarmed, and unmistakably alone. But Jasmine Crockett knew this hearing was no longer just about one man or one network. It had become a mirror held up to the soul of American democracy, and she intended to ask the one question that no one at that table could dodge. What is the cost of power when truth is optional? But Jasmine Crockett knew this hearing was no longer just about one man or one network. It had become a mirror held up to the soul of American democracy, and she intended to ask the one question that no one at that table could dodge. What is the cost of power when truth is optional? She placed both palms flat on the table, leaned forward slightly, and allowed her voice to settle into something deeper than anger conviction. We've heard testimony. We've seen footage. We've exposed a pattern, she said slowly, allowing each word to weigh itself down before continuing. But beneath every segment, every edited headline, every smirk that sold fear, disguised as certainty, there's something far more dangerous, a broken contract between democracy and its messengers. She scanned the panel, then turned toward the gallery as if she were addressing not just the committee, but the country itself. A free press is not a free-for-all, she continued. It is one of the few institutions that can either strengthen the foundation of democracy or help unravel it brick by brick, broadcast by broadcast. Her tone was calm, but each sentence carried the cadence of something meant to last. And when the pursuit of truth is replaced by the pursuit of engagement, when fact is sacrificed for feelings and fear, what remains isn't journalism. It's theater with blood on its hands. Tucker shifted in his seat, recognizing the narrative slipping further from his grasp. He straightened, exhaled sharply, and delivered his counter, not with volume, but with polished familiarity. Congresswoman, he began, I don't dispute the power of media. I've lived it. I've seen it. But freedom, true freedom, must include the freedom to be wrong. That's what the First Amendment guarantees. Not perfect speech, not state-approved speech, just speech. The marketplace of ideas, as chaotic as it may be, is still the best defense against tyranny. He paused, letting the words hang like a shield. What you're proposing, demanding moral accountability for every word, every mistake, every misinterpretation, that's not journalism. That's thought control. He leaned in slightly as if delivering a final blow. The alternative to freedom of expression isn't truth, it's censorship. There was a murmur among the room, soft, cautious, like people unsure if they were hearing a defense or a warning. Jasmine didn't blink. She let Carlson's words settle as one might let smoke clear before walking back into the room. Then with a slow, deliberate inhale, she responded not to him, but to the logic he represented. No, Mr. Carlson, she said, her voice steady, freedom of expression is not freedom from consequence. And it is certainly not the freedom to burn the bridge of national trust and walk away unscathed because your contract didn't include a conscience. She stood now fully her height, adding weight to her next words. You speak of the marketplace of ideas as though truth and falsehood are merely competing brands on a shelf. But you forget that lies, especially when broadcast by those with power, don't just linger. They metastasize. They infect families. They break elections. They turn peaceful citizens into violent mobs. She reached for the Dominion clip again, tapping it lightly with her finger. This wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. It wasn't misjudgment. It was monetization of mistrust. You didn't get it wrong. You got it lucratively right. Tucker opened his mouth, but she kept going. You see, Mr. Carlson, democracy does not crumble under imperfect speech. It crumbles under calculated distortion. It erodes when people with platforms as vast as yours decide that rage is more profitable than reason and that consequences are someone else's burden to carry. She turned to the committee once more, locking eyes with members across the aisle. And when that behavior is defended under the banner of freedom, what we are doing is redefining liberty not as a safeguard of the people, but as a weapon for the powerful. The room was stone still now, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from fatigue, but from realization. Jasmine let the silence breathe, not because she needed time, but because she knew the weight of her next words. Tucker Carlson is not on trial for having an opinion. He is not here because of ideology or politics. He is here because millions of Americans trusted him with the power of their fear, and he sold it back to them at a profit. Her voice dropped lower now. And when the smoke cleared, he called it freedom. She returned to her seat without flourish. The tension in the air remained unbroken. Tucker shifted again, but this time it wasn't strategic, it was defensive. The philosophical ground he had tried to stand on had dissolved under the weight of lived consequences. He had invoked liberty. She had answered with responsibility. And in that contrast, the room had seen the real question emerge. Not can we say anything, but should those with power be allowed to say everything, even when they know it's a lie? The committee chair leaned slightly forward, fingers tented beneath his chin. No gavel dropped. No one rushed to speak. Because what had just happened wasn't procedural, it was tectonic. The foundation had moved, and everyone in the room felt it. But the deeper Jasmine pushed into the roots of media accountability, the more the hearing transformed not merely a courtroom of facts, but a reckoning over the soul of a nation. What is America, and who gets to define it when truth is no longer sacred? Jasmine Crockett straightened in her seat, the static from the microphone briefly cracking as she adjusted it not to amplify her voice, but to center the silence around it. This is bigger than Mr. Carlson. She began, her tone quiet but unshakable. It's bigger than Dominion, bigger than Fox, bigger than the talking points that have been recycled and regurgitated across screens for years. This moment is about the soul of American democracy and whether we still know how to tell the truth when telling lies is more profitable. A few heads turned. A few pens froze mid-sentence. Jasmine's words didn't just land. They reshaped the air in the chamber. Freedom of speech was never meant to be freedom from accountability, she continued. It was meant to protect dissent, not deception. And there is a difference, a crucial one, between questioning authority and undermining reality itself. Tucker Carlson shifted in his chair. The posture was familiar, casual defiance, arms crossed, lips curled slightly at one side. He leaned forward, voice measured, as if rehearsed 100 times in a green room. You speak as though disagreement is a threat to democracy, he said. But dissent is democracy. That's the America I believe in. Not one where speech is policed and opinion punished, but one where every person, whether right or wrong, has the right to be heard. He paused, letting the words breathe. The Constitution doesn't require us to be correct. It demands we be free, and if we lose that, if we lose the right to be wrong, we lose everything that makes this country what it is. There was a moment where some on the panel nodded reflexively. Carlson was playing to an old trusted rhythm, the defender of the misunderstood, the champion of rugged individualism. But Jasmine was ready. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. What you call freedom, she said softly, some of us have only experienced as collateral damage. The room paused, tilted. She continued. You see, Mr. Carlson, there's a cost to the narratives you shape. When you peddled lies about a stolen election, people didn't just debate it online. They loaded their weapons. They boarded buses. They trampled police. They hung nooses. They died. And you, knowing it was false, laughed off the consequences because they were paid for by people whose names you never bothered to learn. Carlson tensed. With all due respect, but Jasmine cut in her voice steel. No, not with all due respect. With all due evidence. With transcripts. With videos. With grieving families. With communities still recovering. You speak of freedom as if it exists in a vacuum. But you have never had to wake up and wonder if someone with your face, your last name, your accent would be the next headline, shot, silenced, or slandered, because someone believed a lie you helped sell. Carlson's smirk returned, but weaker now. You're turning this into a morality play, he said. You've left the facts and entered the theater. The courtroom became a stage the second you turned this into a crusade. She leaned forward, voice lower. And you've mistaken performance for principle your entire career. He blinked hard. Jasmine continued. You want to talk about the real America? Let's talk about it. Your America is one of rugged individuals who answer to no one. Mine is of communities who have never been given the benefit of the doubt. You speak of liberty like it's a birthright. I speak of it like a debt unpaid and accumulating interest with every generation that's told to wait. Carlson clenched his hands, a flash of annoyance slipping past his carefully curated image. You're here because of the liberal media machine he fired. Let's not pretend otherwise. You're a headline wrapped in skin. You are the product of narrative warfare. The insult echoed. Reporters jolted. A few murmurs rippled across the hearing chamber. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She rose fully, deliberately, without theatrics, only gravity. You're right, she said. I am a product, but not of the left. I am the product of justice denied. I am what happens when people are told to wait their turn for 400 years. I am what rises when silence fails. I am not here to be palatable. I am not here to perform. I am here to collect what this country has owed my people since the first lie was told in its founding documents that liberty is universal while its application remains selective. She paused just long enough to let that settle, then continued, voice deeper, not louder. You say you fight for freedom, but tell me, freedom for whom? For those who already have platforms, or for those still shouting from the margins just to be seen? She turned slightly, addressing the room now, not Carlson, not the committee, but the country. You think I'm dangerous because I'm angry, but I'm not angry, I'm focused, because I know what's at stake when people mistake freedom for immunity. When men with microphones forget that words are not toys, they are weapons. And you, Mr. Carlson, have left them on every kitchen table in America, unlocked, loaded, and pointed inward. Carlson had gone pale. Even the committee chair had leaned back in his seat, hands clasped tightly under his chin. Jasmine finished the thought, not for applause, but for history. You think you're the truth teller in the room, she said, but truth doesn't need to be the loudest voice. It needs to be the most accountable. A full minute passed before anyone moved. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom or hold their breath. Tucker Carlson opened his mouth, but for once, nothing came out. But as the silence in the chamber deepened, the outside world erupted because, in the age of digital reckoning, justice doesn't wait for verdicts. It trends. Within minutes of Jasmine's words echoing through the Capitol, a different storm surged outside the chamber walls. Twitter lit up like a battlefield, hashtags firing off with the urgency of protest chants. Crockett crushes Carlson rocketed to the top of U.S. trends, closely followed by free speech under fire, the rallying cry of Tucker's loyalists. Screens across the country split in two. On one side, praise for a woman who had finally forced accountability into a room built to avoid it. On the other, fury from those who believed the great silencing had arrived. TikToks were clipped. Threads dissected every glance, every smirk, every pause. The internet had chosen its arena, and the world was now watching in real time, judging not just the testimony, but the character of its speakers. Back in the chamber, Tucker Carlson felt it. Not through his phone, he hadn't touched it in over an hour, but in the way the room's temperature had shifted. It was in the stiffness of his jaw, in the way his fingers now tapped faster than before against the lacquered wood. His composure, once impervious, began to show hairline fractures. The smirk was gone. The practiced ease of a man used to controlling the narrative had curdled into something less certain, something like dread. For the first time, he wasn't broadcasting a confrontation. He was trapped inside one. Chairman Redding cleared his throat. Let's return to the matter of direct involvement, he said, flipping a page with clinical intent. Mr. Carlson, please explain your role in approving the editorial content related to Dominion voting systems during the period of November to December 2020. Specifically, any on-air language you personally altered or authorized, and how it may have deviated from internal legal advisories. Tucker leaned into the mic, voice tense. I'm not an executive. I wasn't the final filter. Like any anchor, I worked within the framework I was given. Segment outlines were approved, Jasmine cut in. Yet your name appears on no less than 12 emails where you personally rejected fact-checking language proposed by legal counsel. One email dated November 14th states, and I quote, "If we soften it now, we lose them. If we lose them, we lose everything." That's not editorial review. That's strategy. So I ask again, were you acting as a journalist or as a brand manager for outrage? Tucker's mouth tightened. Context matters, he replied, but his voice cracked just slightly. I was protecting editorial independence. Editorial independence from your own legal department. Jasmine asked, the corner of her lip barely lifting. Interesting definition. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his tie. The facade of absolute control so carefully constructed was now visibly strained. The questions were no longer abstract. They were forensic. And Jasmine delivered each one with the slow, cold clarity of someone who had walked defendants into corners for a living. She laid out more evidence documents showing coordinated narratives between Tucker's producers and far-right influencers. Slack messages from his staff mocking Dominion while scripting segments about its dangerous influence. Audio clips where fact checks were deliberately stripped because it'll kill the engagement. Each piece of evidence was a blow not dramatic, not loud, but precise. A methodical dismantling of the empire he had built atop the illusion of credibility. Tucker's face reddened. His breathing had changed. He kept reaching for his pen, not to write, but to do something with his hands. Anything. A man once fluent in provocation was now caught in a language he no longer controlled. But Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She sat upright, poised, her rhythm, slow, relentless. Like cross-examination in a courtroom where there's only one real witness, the truth. You've claimed repeatedly, she said, turning another page without breaking eye contact, that your platform was about amplifying voices the mainstream ignored. But what happens when that megaphone gets pointed in the wrong direction? When it becomes a weapon, not a warning? Her voice lowered not with softness, but with weight. Did you ever stop to consider who would get hurt? Not metaphorically, not in comment sections, but in real life, in ballot boxes, in courtrooms, on Capitol steps. Did you ever think beyond the camera? Carlson opened his mouth, but she cut him off again, gently but firmly. No, because the camera was enough, because the applause was enough, and the danger that belonged to someone else. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting for collapse or confession. Chairman Redding spoke next. Mr. Carlson, would you like to respond on the record to the materials just presented? Carlson gripped the sides of his chair. This is a show trial, he said finally, his voice thinner than before. You're crucifying me for making people uncomfortable, for giving them an alternative narrative when institutions failed them. Jasmine didn't flinch. No, Mr. Carlson. You're not being crucified for telling the truth. You're being questioned for monetizing lies. And discomfort isn't the issue. Disinformation is. Twitter erupted again. Crockett crushes Carlson hit 3 million uses in under 2 hours. The phrase was no longer just a trend. It was a headline, a meme, a t-shirt design. The hashtag wasn't just commentary, it had become evidence that something irreversible had just occurred. Inside the chamber, Jasmine remained still. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smirking. Her work wasn't about virality, it was about accountability. She knew the cameras would fade, the platforms would move on. But somewhere right now, a school civics teacher was downloading this hearing for her students. A voter in Michigan was replaying the clip. A young black girl in Louisiana was watching and whispering, "That's what power looks like when it remembers where it came from." Tucker, meanwhile, had gone quiet again. His face had hardened not with arrogance, but with calculation. He knew what was coming next. More exhibits, more questions, more hours under the surgical precision of a woman who never flinched because she had lived through storms far louder than him. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett never wavered, never stumbled. She sat like a former prosecutor, like the child of a movement, like the echo of justice long denied, but no longer delayed. And as the weight of truth began crushing the last defenses of spectacle, Jasmine didn't reach for triumph. She reached for precision, for clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial and no air for escape. Jasmine Crockett remained standing, arms at her side, chin level, her voice a controlled tremor of resolve. The room was still, but it wasn't quiet, not really. Silence had become something else entirely now. Not a pause, but a pressure, a countdown. Everyone in the chamber felt it, that unmistakable pull when something irreversible is about to be said. Jasmine turned slightly toward Tucker Carlson, not with vengeance, not with heat, but with the brutal calm of someone who had carried the truth too long to speak it softly anymore. You call it media, she said, voice clear, stripped of ornament. I call it the weaponization of lies. The words dropped like a gavel in slow motion. No one breathed. No one blinked. The overhead lights seemed to hum louder in the silence. Cameras frozen mid-zoom as if even the machines knew this wasn't content. This was consequence. Tucker didn't move. Not yet. His hands, which had spent the morning gesturing, flipping, deflecting, now clenched the edge of the table. He had no answer. Not because he lacked one, but because nothing he could say would survive the sound of what had just been spoken. Chairman Redding looked down at the folder in front of him, then back to the panel. His voice when it came was somber, almost reluctant. The Committee on Oversight and Accountability recommends that the full record of today's hearing be referred to the Department of Justice. He said slowly, like the words themselves required effort. Specifically for investigation into the willful dissemination of knowingly false information with intent to incite harm, undermine democratic process, or profit from deception in violation of federal broadcast standards and civil harm statutes. He glanced around the room not for consensus, but confirmation that everyone understood what had just happened. The panel nodded, one by one, not theatrically, not eagerly, but in grim recognition. This wasn't a political win. This was the moment the air changed. The moment the machinery of justice, slow, imperfect, overdue, finally stirred beneath its dust and moved. Tucker's chair creaked as he finally stood. No dramatic protest, no exit line, no final attempt to reframe the moment for cable reruns. His face, once elastic with smugness, had collapsed into stone. He looked at Jasmine once, just once, but there was nothing in his eyes now. No contempt, no fury, only absence. The look of a man who had spent years narrating every room he walked into, and now had no voice in the one that would define him. He walked out without a word. The door clicked shut behind him like the end of an era. Inside the chamber, no one applauded. No one cheered. Jasmine sat down the same way she had entered, steady, silent, and alone. Because justice, when it finally arrives, isn't loud. It doesn't dance. It doesn't pose for headlines. It simply is. Across the country, news alerts lit up phones. Carlson referred to DOJ, they read. Crockett delivers final blow. Some headlines praised, others panicked. On social media, the war intensified. Crockett crushes. Carlson merged with truth is not treason. Hashtags turned into declarations. The hearing was clipped, dissected, live-streamed to millions who had never watched a full congressional session before in their lives. But Jasmine wasn't watching the screens. In the small private holding room behind the chamber, she stood alone at the window watching the rain smear itself against Capitol glass. Her hands were still, her jaw tense, not with pride, but with memory, because she remembered what it took to get here, the years in underfunded courtrooms, the angry emails, the threats, the locked doors and whispered warnings. She remembered being told more times than she could count that calling out power too directly was a career risk. That truth was best served with a smile and a softer tone, but today she hadn't smiled, and the truth had been sharp. Behind her, an aide entered the room with a tablet. They're saying it's the most watched hearing in years, he said softly. Over 12 million views and counting. She didn't turn around. Then I hope someone heard the parts that mattered, she said, not just the ones that trended. The aide hesitated. You think DOJ will really act? Jasmine finally looked over her shoulder. I think we gave them no place to hide. Outside, journalists swarmed the Capitol steps. Some were shouting questions. Others were just waiting, hoping to catch the first image of a man who had made a fortune telling America what to fear, now facing something he could no longer spin. But Carlson never returned, and Jasmine didn't need to chase the cameras, because sometimes power isn't in the performance. It's in the stillness after the reckoning, in the moment the lie collapses under the weight of its own repetition, and silence finally tells the truth. The echo of the hearing still hung in the chamber like smoke after a controlled detonation, but Jasmine knew history doesn't end with silence. It only pauses to take a breath. The doors of the chamber creaked open, not with thunder, but with the quiet authority of aftermath. Jasmine Crockett stepped through them into a hallway, flooded with white marble light, her heels clicking like clockwork on stone, polished by generations of footsteps, most of them male, most of them indifferent. The corridor didn't cheer. It didn't erupt. But scattered among the aides and observers, a handful of people stood. A few clapped, not for show, not for spectacle, but as if they couldn't help themselves, as if they had just seen something rupture and weren't sure if it would ever be rebuilt again. A security guard nodded at her, the kind of nod that says everything and nothing. A law student on the sidelines clutched a notebook to her chest, eyes wide with reverence and questions she didn't yet know how to ask. And then cutting through the stillness, a voice young cracking slightly, like it had rehearsed this moment in the mirror. "You made me believe," said the student, "that the truth can still win." Jasmine stopped. Just for a moment. She turned, and the weight of the day, the decades behind it, the centuries behind that, flashed for a heartbeat in her eyes. Then she gave the student the only thing that mattered. Not a soundbite, not a smile, but a steady gaze and a single nod that said, "Don't stop, because they won't." And then she walked on. Outside, the press was already splitting at the seams. Microphones shoved forward. Headlines flashed across digital tickers. Jasmine crushes. Carlson blared across liberal feeds. Freedom on trial blinked on conservative screens. Commentators screamed into split screens, voices growing hoarse before the sun could even begin to set. On the evening, news anchors debated whether Jasmine was the conscience America had waited for, or the censor it feared. Hero, heretic, defender, destroyer. Every angle was fighting to define her. None of them had asked who she was. By nightfall, her face had been photoshopped onto Lady Liberty and Stalin in equal measure. But Jasmine wasn't watching. Her SUV pulled up quietly behind the Capitol steps. She climbed in without a word, the door shutting behind her, like the final period on a book she had been forced to write in real time. The city glowed outside the tinted glass. Sirens somewhere in the distance. A protest forming near the National Mall. Someone had already spray-painted her name on the concrete wall outside the courthouse. "Crockett spoke for us." She said nothing. The car wound through DC's arteries like a ghost finally pulling up outside a small government building, with no press, no flashbulbs. Just gray stone and quiet resolve. Her office. Inside, the lights were off. The silence was heavier here, not from judgment, but from exhaustion. She walked past her desk without slowing toward the filing cabinet at the back of the room, the one marked only by an etched brass plaque, "Hearings active and pending." She unlocked the top drawer, the sound of the key turning, breaking the hush like a match striking steel. Slowly, methodically, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, thick seal labeled with a name that hadn't yet hit the headlines. Another figure, another lie, another system weaponizing silence. She placed it in the drawer, top shelf, and for a long moment she didn't move. She just stood there, the woman who had brought down one of the most powerful media personalities in the country, with nothing but her voice, her discipline, and her refusal to blink, staring at the next battle already waiting. This is what justice looks like when it doesn't rest. This is what it costs when you win and know it isn't over. She closed the drawer, locked it, and exhaled once quietly through her nose, not like a sigh, but like a recalibration, a return to center. And as she turned off the light and walked back into the night, she didn't look back. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She was just getting started. And when the doors closed behind her and the cameras finally turned away, what remained wasn't the noise, but the question echoing in every hallway of power. What do we do with truth once it's been spoken out loud? The lesson isn't just about law. It isn't even just about power. It's about something harder to hold and even harder to restore once it's been shattered trust. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that hearing room to become a symbol. She walked in because, for too long, truth had been treated like a guest in its own house, welcomed when convenient, silenced when profitable. The cost of her voice wasn't just criticism, it was isolation. It was knowing that every word would be dissected, twisted, reframed, not by those who misunderstood her, but by those who understood her perfectly and feared what her clarity could dismantle. And yet she spoke, because that's what courage looks like in a country where silence is often rewarded and truth is penalized at scale. The injustice she faced wasn't a new villain in an old courtroom. It was older than the building itself. It was systemic, surgical, invisible, until someone held it up to the light and dared to name it. Every time Jasmine asked a question that cut too deep, she wasn't just confronting a man. She was confronting a machine, a system that had learned how to turn disinformation into income fear, into fuel and spectacle, into sovereignty. And when she refused to flinch, she broke more than a witness. She broke the rhythm of letting the loudest define reality, the rhythm of allowing power to wear a smile while it empties truth of meaning. But this isn't a fairy tale. Jasmine's story doesn't end with applause or comfort, because real justice doesn't come gift-wrapped. It arrives with bloodshot eyes, lonely rides home, and headlines that call you both a hero and a threat sometimes on the same day. The human lesson in her story isn't about a victory, it's about endurance. The kind of endurance that ordinary people carry when they fight systems designed to outlast them. The kind of endurance that says, I will speak even if it changes nothing, because silence has already changed too much. There's something deeply American about the collision between Crockett and Carlson, not because of the spectacle, but because of the paradox. One used speech to manipulate, the other used silence to shatter it. One believed freedom meant immunity from responsibility. The other believed it meant being accountable to something larger than yourself. And in that clash, we're left with a haunting question. What happens when a nation confuses noise with truth and ratings with righteousness? Jasmine's confrontation teaches us that truth is no longer enough to win. It must be armed, structured, delivered with the precision of law and the resilience of those who have nothing left to lose. In today's world, truth doesn't whisper, it has to roar. And even when it roars, it still might be drowned out. But it must still try. Because when we give up on that fight, we surrender the only weapon that doesn't leave blood behind. But there's another lesson here, quieter, deeper. Jasmine didn't just defeat a man. She reminded a generation what it looks like when someone carries pain without letting it poison them. She reminded us that poise is not the absence of fury, but the discipline to wield that fury with purpose. That integrity isn't the performance of goodness, it's the refusal to compromise when no one is watching. That every courtroom, every hearing, every moment of confrontation is a chance not to win, but to make meaning. And meaning is what our democracy is dying for. Her final act, placing another file into that cabinet, wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. Justice doesn't sleep, not because it's noble, but because it's never finished. In a country drowning in narratives, people like Jasmine remind us that evidence still matters, that arguments can still be sharp without being cruel, that leadership doesn't require perfection, only presence, discipline, and the willingness to be hated in the service of truth. So what do we take from this? We take the reminder that truth doesn't protect itself. It requires people, risk, fire, sacrifice. It requires someone to stand up, even if they know the blowback will come 10 times harder. It requires someone to sit across from power, stare it in the eye and say, not today, not this time. Jasmine Crockett did that, quietly, brutally, without blinking. And in doing so, she didn't just reveal what one man had done. She reminded the rest of us what one woman unbought, unbroken, and unafraid still can. But stories like Jasmine Crockett's don't end at the courthouse steps, they begin there. Because truth alone doesn't change the world. People do. So now the question turns to you, not as a spectator, not as someone scrolling headlines, but as someone living in the very world that allowed this story to happen. What will you do with what you just saw? Will you let it fade into another forgotten hearing, another clipped soundbite buried under the next scandal? Or will you carry it not just in your memory but in your actions? Because injustice doesn't rest, and silence will always be the cheapest ally of power. Jasmine stood alone so others wouldn't have to. She didn't need your applause, she needed your echo, your voice, your vote, your willingness to question, to challenge, to fight back, not with noise, but with clarity. And the next time someone tells you that truth is subjective, that power cannot be held accountable, that one voice can't make a difference, remember this, it already did. So don't just watch. Don't just repost. Stand, speak. Ask the hard questions in your classroom, in your newsroom, in your dinner table debates. Refuse to let comfort become complicity. Refuse to let power go unchecked because it's louder or better funded. Refuse to believe that justice is someone else's job, Because Jasmine wasn't the first, and if we're lucky, she won't be the last. But the distance between her courage and your silence is where injustice survives. Close it. Close it now, before another lie finds its stage, before another truth dies in the dark, before the next hearing is about you and no one is left to speak your name. And remember this above, all democracy is not defended in courtrooms or on cable shows alone. It is defended in the everyday courage of ordinary people who refuse to look away. Your kitchen table, your ballot, your voice, they are the battlegrounds. The lies we tolerate today become the chains we inherit tomorrow. Do not inherit silence. Do not pass it on. Break it. Speak. Act. Because history does not wait, and neither should you. And if you doubt that your voice matters, look at what just happened. A single woman armed only with documents and conviction shifted the balance of a room built to protect power. That wasn't magic. It wasn't chance. It was choice, the choice to speak when silence was safer, to risk being dismissed so others wouldn't be deceived. That same choice lies before you now. You don't need a gavel or a spotlight. You don't need a committee or a camera. You need only the courage to tell the truth in the spaces you already occupy. Every conversation, every question, every refusal to accept the easy lie is a brick laid in the defense of democracy. Do not underestimate that. Change has never come from comfort. It has come from ordinary people who decided that not me and not today were enough to bend history. So take that step, because silence writes no legacy, but your courage can. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.